All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Again, thanks, Eleanor, for pulling this together. And thank you to the fellows for allowing me to come into your space. And thanks to everyone who's joining from outside of that space. I see some friends from different areas and maybe some new folks. I have a practice I learned long ago of trying to get everyone's voice in the room as soon as possible. And I know we don't necessarily have a lot of time to do like a whole check-in and get to know you. But I want to invite anyone who is here virtually, if you'd like to drop into the chat who you are, where you're joining from, maybe what inspired you to join today. And then pay attention to each other because I also think I like to use every gathering as an opportunity to build community. And that's a little trick we could use for that. So maybe you'll make a new friend today as well. So I also want to share in the chat my slides in case those can be a resource. So I'm putting that in there now. And great. So, yeah, my topic today, the kind of overarching theme is weaving. A little bit about me. Whoops, let me get this moving. So, my name's April. I live in Chicago, as Eleanor mentioned. I live in the Little Village neighborhood, which is a really rich, amazing, just bursting with culture and local economy, mostly Hispanic, and Mexican roots. And definitely been dealing with a lot the last 6 months or so with the administration's attack on immigrants and people of color. So that's been a reality for a lot of my neighbors recently that I've been somewhat present for and trying to be a part of resisting and protecting folks. Originally from Florida, attended New College of Florida, which has been sort of taken over in recent years by DeSantis and his ilk. And I've lived a few other places in the world in my time, which have informed my work and my learning and my practices, including Indianapolis, Sicily, New York, and DC. Yeah, I'm also an artist, so that informs my work. It's always been something I bring into both the way I see things and the way I show up and the way I try to contribute and also include others in this work of weaving and community building and social and economic change. So one of the things that Eleanor asked me to speak about was my theories of change. And I have used and taught other people about theories of change in the past, but I will admit it's not something I use a lot lately. I think it's more of something that I carry internally, right? And a theory of change is something that's often used to articulate, how do we define a problem? How do we define the ways that we're going about trying to address and solve that problem? What are the impacts that we hope to achieve? So I'm going to speak about some of my theories of change. I blend theories of change as part of my work, so I don't really have just one. But as part of that, I wanted to weave in about a bit of my own journey. So I'm going to share those theories of change as part of my narrative of where I've been picking up different things along the way, how those make up my practice and my way of viewing change and weaving. So, want to give credit real quick to one of my earliest teachers of the work of community building and weaving, which was my grandmother, my ancestor, Pauline Anna Goat Williams. So, calling her into the room, she was one of those people that is just a natural, authentic connector. She never met a stranger. She was sassy and friendly and treated everyone equally, which was not the norm necessarily in the South back in her day. And she was amazing at bringing people together over food, right? Which is one of the core practices of community building. And I would argue also a lot of social change efforts. So she was one of my early teachers of the work I do and have been instinctively drawn to. Also, part of my journey was really early immersion in the life of community that looked a little different than what I think a lot of people growing up in America experienced. So I was part of a school that was in a community that was really built and created for the people who lived in that community called Kashi Ashram. This was in Sebastian, Florida. And it gave me this experience of observing, not only how school can be so different because we met in classrooms or were porches and living rooms, but I also got to see ways of living that were much more cooperative. and rooted in kind of people pitching in together, not living this sort of isolated and alienated, single family houses, but people lived together very closely. They worked and they ate and they created together, using their talents as they were called upon, for the greater community. Also, I had a weird penchant for collecting business cards as a kid. So I think there was something in me that was very drawn to this idea that there's actually quite a bit of abundance all around us in the gifts and talents and skills that people have. And that having that information and being able to use and act on it was very important. And I was also bothered from an early age with a sense of deep disconnection that I felt between people and communities, between people and the earth. I was fortunate to grow up on lots of acres of land, and had a strong connection with nature and the earth. And I also felt there was like this disconnection and abuse of the land. And certainly, racial divisions, class divisions, those are really present to me from an early age. And then part of my journey, I really kind of just stepped into this passion and this interest in community. Also from an early age, as a teenager, I went and like immersed myself in different intentional communities, including Zendik community, which they were like a self-proclaimed revolutionary artist community in North Carolina. My parents let me go to that. I was really interested in the Zapatistas. I explored other intentional communities that were both activist and more like spiritually based, because I just had this sense of like there's something important here that is missing in our larger society. There's some answer here. As I went to college, I studied sociology at New College. I also leaned into that inquiry and I found stories about, learned more about the Zapatistas, learned about the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston, where the residents there were some of the first to win eminent domain for themselves to really create what they wanted in their community and have that power to exercise that and really build their own reality. And the Highlander Center, which was this, historic movement weaver, that had such a huge impact on from the 30s, right, of bringing different movement and activist folks together over time to learn from each other, to build coalitions. So those were really informative, inspiring to me. And I think the fact that I dug into those and was writing about them and researching them, what led to my professor, Dr. Brain was his real name. He handed me this big green book at the end of one of our office hours and said, I think you might be interested in this. And this was Building Communities from the Inside Out, Path Toward Finding and Mobilizing a Community's Assets by Jody Kretzmann and John McKnight. So I read this book. I was completely blown away, because I found that there was this answer there that I had been seeking, and not finding in these other kind of communities and change efforts where, these intentional communities were often very insular, and had kind of it's us against the world, or, we're the ones that are going to change everything, but they really weren't. They were just a small group of people, and a lot of often unspoken power dynamics that weren't really addressed. And then in these activist spaces, it was often very kind of just like angry all the time, right? Righteously angry, but not a lot of community, right? Not a lot of like relationship for relationship's sake, or joy or creativity being cultivated. So what I found in this book, which proposed an approach to change called asset-based community development, it was rooted in years of research as well as lived experience that the authors John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann had organizing and documenting the work and viewpoints of people in communities, specifically in Chicago, but also beyond. And they had done years of research to learn what had created change in neighborhoods across the country. And what they found was that the change that had really taken root had two characteristics. The first was that it was led by the people who lived in a neighborhood. It was their ideas that they built upon, that they defined what the issue was. They pulled together other neighbors, and allies to realize their vision, right? They chose a topic, they led the change. The other one was that they drew upon what they already had as a first stepping point, right? So they were like, okay, like we want to do something around youth. Well, who has some teaching skills? Who has some space we can use? Who has some materials we can use for some craft projects, or know someone who does, right? They drew on what they already had to together lead the change that they wanted to see. And this book was a collection of all of these stories, amazing stories, So what they proposed as an effective methodology for change, lasting change in community, was to, shift from a viewpoint that had really taken hold, and it still honestly is quite dominant, of our communities as being full of needs and deficiencies and problems, right? And this was something that, at least it's John and Jody, this was something that John had realized after being invited to lead an institute with the Northwestern University here in Chicago, when he went around and talked to the academics in the department, and he found that the understanding, so let's skip ahead, the understanding that they had of the communities that they were studying and writing about and then sending people out to go do work in was all deficiencies, right? They had tons of data and tons of analyses of how many dropouts there were, how many welfare recipients, how much lead poisoning, how many gangs, right? Gangs. So this is like a needs map that they illustrated to show, this is the lens that people have of communities, especially, urban communities, those that have been disenfranchised and disinvested over years. And what they proposed was that we start by doing what these neighbors did that we found actually made a difference, and had stories to report, is that we start with what's there. And they had collected different approaches that neighbors had come up with themselves to affect that change. So the theory of change of ABCD, as I would articulate it, right, is that, begin with communities that are often disconnected, many having experienced targeted disinvestment and disenfranchisement rooted in racist and other systems of oppression, as well as extractive capitalism, right, I would name. Systems, organizations, and professionals that are meant to help such communities often do so from this flawed and inaccurate lens of deficiency, right? Looking at folks as mostly just needing to be helped and saved, with their programs, with their trainings, with their resources that they bring in from the outside. And these have been shaped, right, by many different things, by stereotypes, by narratives, by research, media, training, and policies that people receive before they go out and do work in communities. The result, the negative impact of this, of course, is that, we have all of these outside-in interventions that are brought into communities and ignore the existing capacities as well as the existing work that's being done, often under the radar, to improve the lives of people within the neighborhoods, right? The small businesses that are supporting each other, the neighbors that are looking out for each other, Mrs. Williams, who has the youth come over to her house after school and is, really an unofficial mentor and even therapist for them. Right. So we overlook these things. And there's often funding that's flowed, significant funding flowed into these programs, from the outside in, that then actually never reaches the neighbors and residents themselves, but it's these paid professionals that come in to do interventions that often, they might make some difference, but they rarely make the difference that, something that the residents themselves defining, leading, pitching in on, could make, right? And oftentimes those resident-led things are very underfunded, they're unrecognized. So those continue while these other programs come in and often actually do harm, right? They can recreate this sense of dependency, this sense of, we don't have enough here to work with. We're needy, we're deficiency. They can often create leaders who sell the narrative of deficiency in order to get funding, and unfortunately, like, represent their own community in a negative light, in order to try to get anything done, because that's the way that funding and programs are designed. And then, of course, the control and the power remains outside of residents' hands. So the interventions that are then part of the work of shifting this trend, are to go about the work of reconnecting and reweaving communities and community members together, reconnecting folks with their shared identity, working with a wonderful community leader, Cleophas, who's here today, who's organizing a session that's going to be doing just this. And they're starting with the fact that Bronzeville community used to basically look like Tulsa, right? Had Black Wall Street, thriving, local economic, world cultural abundance, right? So reconnecting people with not only what's possible, but also what has been. is major work of ABCD, and reconnecting folks with a sense that, you know what, actually, we have the solutions, we have our own ideas, we are the experts of our own situation. Certainly, we can accept the help of others, but we're the ones who really need to be the primary drivers, definers, and doers of this work. And we also have a great power, which is to invite our other neighbors to join us, right? Very few people can replicate the invitational power of neighbors to involve each other. And then, of course, it's the work of, really carefully and thoughtfully involving everyone as much as possible, right? These kinds of community efforts that John and Jody were documenting, they involved young people, they involved elders, they involved people labeled with disabilities, because the idea was, we're not here to like help and serve people as much as we are to use everyone's gifts and talents, because like we need all of it, right? That's often the way that community operates. We don't necessarily have a whole bunch of funding and programming, so we need literally what everyone can bring to the table. And then the other really core practice and intervention of asset-based community development is to engage with those who are coming in from the outside of a community to kind of, do a power shift, right? And help them rediscover their humility, and their sense of, we're here to serve the will, the direction and leadership of community members. Our resources should be at their disposal. One thing we say in the field is, professionals and outside helpers should be on tap rather than on top. And a lot of times, as many who've done work in community know, that's not the case, right? Institutions come in with a lot of funding and programming, and they have an agenda, right? And there's not always a lot of room to adjust that to make way for what residents want to do or are already doing. So this is one visual I really love that was developed by Mike Green, to document. So the upper circles show like this ongoing work of discovering what people care about, moving folks to meaningful action and making connections, right? So this is work of weaving and uncovering, like what's the energy, what's the capacity that's there. And within that is constantly doing the work of relationship building and learning conversations. And then there's the process of, as you're growing the work within a community, right? You start small. You start with who's ready to show up. You bring other people who are motivated with this idea of connectivity. You bring them together, and then together you work on bringing in a larger group. So that's kind of a glimpse into some of the fundamental dynamics of the ABC process. We also talk a lot about asset mapping. So I like to think of it as, before you go out to the grocery store, you look at what's in your pantry. You look at what's in your fridge, right? We don't know what we need until we know what we have already. So a core practice of ABCD is to, find whatever way works for your community. And this is something you do personally in your own life or in your family as well, and map out what are the assets that we have. I won't go too deep into all the 6 assets, but John and Jody did originally map out. There's 6 kinds of assets that exist in neighborhoods. These were the 3 kind of core ones. It's the gifts of individuals, which we always want to center. Citizen associations, so those can be your block clubs, your churches, your cultural groups, your walking clubs, right? Unofficial, more official, and then local institutions that are more formal, businesses, libraries, community colleges, schools, hospitals, right? And we could brainstorm a whole bunch more as a group. And then this is another lovely, more modern visual of these different assets, which also include our local economy, our physical assets, and our culture and our stories. And so, unleashing these processes where people can start to discover, connect, and utilize the assets that they already have. This is another visual. So this is a phrase that just to me also really encapsulates an asset-based approach from Aboriginal activist Lila Watson. She said, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Right. And so one thing I love about ABCD, I know a lot in the last couple decades, there's been more awareness of how problematic the sort of savior instinct is, right? Especially the white savior. But this helping in a way that isn't actually seeing each other as in solidarity with each other, right? And that whatever dynamics and problems we're taking on, that we're all actually part of that liberatory process. And that makes us equals. And that, whoever we're trying to help, we actually just need to recognize that we're part of that process ourselves. This is a little drawing I made to kind of represent how I see the ABCD process is like you start, you dig where you are, you unleash abundance, and then through that process, you work together to build structures and processes that support that abundance to come to life to really create the vision and the reality that a community wants. All right, I'm going to try to move quickly through this next section so that we can talk about a couple of the other theories of change, and also include how it connects to what I've been witnessing and a part of in Chicago. So just a quick visual, there's many practices that make up an asset-based process. Some of the core ones are in this visual around the center, learning conversations and listening campaigns, finding and supporting the connectors that are already existing in neighborhoods, asset mapping, which I spoke a little bit about, and then the work of shifting and sharing power, which sometimes involves introspection. It sometimes can involve some reflective processes with groups, both people from outside helping institutions and the community itself. And then around the edges are some more practices that are deeply supportive of ABCD. And the four questions that we like to think about and design our processes in really conscious of are around the top, which is, the question that we should always start with is what can citizens, and we don't mean that in a legal sense, but more people who are active and exercising their agency in their community and in society. What can citizens do alone? What can they do by themselves with each other? What can citizens do with some outside help? What can only institutions do? And then what should institutions stop doing? So those are really valuable questions, a series of questions. The problem is that most of our interventions start with question number 3. Completely forget to spend any time with 1 and 2. And they rarely really address number 4. Yes. So impact, when we do an asset-based process, we, typically what results and what we're hoping to achieve is residents who are leading the change that they wish to see, right? Community self-determination. They're the definers, the producers, leaders, and evaluators of their own initiatives. Local capacities are unleashed and activated, many of which had sat kind of on the sidelines and even been buried by labels of deficiency, like say folks who have disabilities, folks who might be experiencing homelessness, right? A lot of latent assets are activated. Outside resources can be leveraged and put to use under the direction of community members. Care, right? Because this is a very relational process, people can begin to step up and reconnect those systems of care that used to be pretty strong in our communities, whether it's caring for our elders, caring for our young people, parents caring for each other, and sharing, child rearing responsibilities. Already mentioned, right, those who are labeled can become part of the life of the community in a new way, where they're not just seen for their labels and their deficiencies, but for what they have to offer. So it's a very healing process, to be honest. And then finally, those services and programs that are created and introduced into community are actually those that are needed and necessary as a supplement to what communities themselves can do. All right. Let's see. I want to be conscious of time. There's a few quick case studies here, but also because we got started a little bit after the hour, I'm going to tell you this real quick example that was part of my own journey of learning. So this was the work that was done by Broadway United Methodist Church in Indianapolis, Indiana. So the pastor there, Mike Mather, he had come across some of John McKnight's writings early in his career and had begun thinking about, okay, how do I not be a savior? How do I be a neighbor, right? How do I think about these communities that I'm serving? And he was typically in white congregations that were serving a Black and lower income neighborhood that had been heavily disinvested. And here in Indianapolis, that was the same case. So he, really tried to integrate that thinking into the way that he ran the church. And his first step was to basically just go and walk the neighborhood and have conversations with neighbors, not in a way that he was trying to sell them on the church or coming to the church, which is often what like outreach efforts are about, but genuinely just to get to know people, get to know their lives, what they were doing, and build relationships. Through doing that, he met a man named Diamond Hargis, who was a neighbor. He was an artist. He had a young daughter that he'd walk around the neighborhood with her on his shoulders, and he would talk to neighbors. And what Mike discovered was that Diamond had this incredible knack for getting to know people's gifts. and finding ways to connect them creatively and powerfully so that they could, create new things together so that they could be in each other's lives in meaningful ways. So what Mike decided to do was to go back to his church and find some resources to hire Diamond as a connector in the neighborhood. And he said, "Hey, we want to hire you to do what you've already been doing, and we want you to come up with your own job title." So Diamond came up with the title, the Roving Listener. So he became the official roving listener of the neighborhood through the church. And over the next several months, he went and had conversations intentionally, learned people's gifts and talents, learned what good things they were doing for and with each other in the neighborhood. And then he would come back to the church and tell stories, and he would introduce Mike to them. They would come up with like, what can we do with this, right? So, and they did many, many things. I don't have time to tell the entire story, but some of the things that came out of that was, as they started to notice patterns, right? They would find 5 different gardeners that didn't know each other, and then they would use some resources from the church to get a meal. They would hire a neighborhood cook who said that was one of their gifts, and someone who liked to host, and they would host a meal in the neighborhood with the gardeners. And very little really needed to be done. If you get people who care about something together, they tend to kind of create their own agenda, right? So the gardeners just started swapping seeds and stories and decided to start a tool lending library for the neighborhood. Right. And that took off. And then they got the artists together and they started getting together and kind of supporting each other in their careers. And then they wanted to do things for the neighborhood kids. And then the church said, "Hey, like we've actually got space in our church because one of the assets we have is way too much space." So they gave them an entire room. So when I visited first in Indianapolis, like they showed me the art room. One of the rules was you couldn't leave the room without painting something on the floor. And this was them having a really informal kind of gathering with these young people from the neighborhood to stop by, and we're learning about what these other artists did and doing things for the younger people in the neighborhood. And then one of the third things that they did, again, there's many, many things that flowed out of this, but they decided to change up their youth program entirely, from being a kind of outside in, they did cheerleading for the girls and basketball for the boys. They paid someone from out of the neighborhood to come in and facilitate these. And what they did was that instead they put that money towards hiring youth in the neighborhood who wanted to do what Diamond was doing. So now they expanded the number of connectors in the neighborhood, and they formed the Roving Youth Corps. Diamond, did a bit of training and encouragement and facilitation of that process. And then these young people were going out, having similar conversations with their neighbors and doing this part of weaving, right? Weaving together the power and the interest in the neighborhood. There was many other things that happened, including facilitating neighbors to come together and address issues of teen pregnancy with their own really amazing creative projects, that I think a lot, like at least one was still running last time I was in Indianapolis. So that's one case study of, applying this thinking to kind of stepping out of that savior model. I won't go into these, but they are in the slides and there's some links in them. There's a wonderful story from Denver, Colorado. Oh, and I'm going to move through this real quick for the sake of time. These are just some of the tools and practices that you can uh, explore in the slides after this. But really, these are some of the practices that I showed in that early graphic, working with connectors, holding learning conversations. And these are some, ABCDs have been around since the 90s. And one of the ways that we talk about it, it's really not something that John and Jody invented. They just gave a name to the way that communities have effectively organized since time without beginning. But many other streams of work also show up in other arenas that use an asset-based approach, some consciously, some unconsciously, some because it's just a good way of doing things. So here's a slide that shows kind of the abundance of different approaches that mirror ABCD. All right. And Eleanor, I want to do a quick time check and just see. Um, I know we wanted to make sure there's time for questions and answers. I had a couple of other theories of change I could go through real quickly and talk about weaving. Is that good?
Is that good? Right now, I think now is a good time to transition to Q&A. I wonder if maybe some other questions might lead to discussion of some other concepts and theories of change.
Mhm.
But if you would like to take another few minutes to go through another slide or two or sort of wrap up your thoughts, please do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
sure.
Oh, I've
Oh,
got it.
I've got it. Go.
I think
I
maybe
think.
Eleanor, do you want to mute? Let's see, testing. Okay, great. That's better. Thank you. So I wanted to add, there's two other levels that make up my kind of collection of theories of change. And one is that while ABCD is very powerful, and even within the field, we say ABCD is necessary, but not sufficient, right? There's more that we need to take into consideration when we're going about really trying to change our communities, change the world, change the systems. And one that, I kind of rediscovered as part of my journey in the last 5 or so years was, the necessity of really looking at our political economic system, the impact it has on our communities, the impact it has on our nations and on our personal lives. So I think that is something that really is like a growing edge for both the ABCD community and field is how do we integrate awareness and an understanding of the fundamental flaws of our economic system that does then shape everything else. It shapes our political systems. It shapes the way that we live and relate to each other, especially as it was born out of a, white supremacist, racialized origin. And so, I think most of us here understand, right, the impacts of the extractive economy that's, rooted in infinite growth within a finite system, with profit as the driving motive. And for me, what my work has been over the last few years has been, really diving into learning about this, but then applying an asset-based mentality to how do we go about addressing this problem, right? So, my work is really around, okay, we have a lot of solutions around us. We actually have a lot to work with. There are many, many people who are experimenting with and also drawing on long lineages of, post-capitalist and alternatives to capitalism, of cooperative, deeply democratic ways of doing economy, of ways of living in community with one another. And that, so we have a lot to work with. So what would it look like to apply these ABCD principles? And, my work has been not only how do we make all of these experiments and assets that we have available more visible, but how do we be intentional about weaving them together, right? And what I've been doing is stepping into and collaborating and working within spaces that are intentional about that. There's a Resistant Build network. There's, of course, the work of Next System, which is seeking to do that. And then there's other wonderful groups to point to, like the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. And another part that I think is incredibly important to this, which I know is very, very much part of Next System, is have a culture of learning and possibility, right? Because often when you get into the work of activism and system change, there can be a lot of division and turfism around, well, this is my ideology and you don't fit with it, so we actually can't really work together. But when we have a space and a culture of learning and saying, okay, like I have a piece of the puzzle, I stand by that, but you have another one. And if we're going to pull this off, we're up against quite a well-funded and powerful, other set of forces. So we probably really need each other's assets, right? And then just one other methodology that I found really useful from ABCD is to think about, we talk in ABCD about bringing together the association of associations. So we have these preformed group of citizens that are doing work they care about. And so there's kind of a next level of organizing where you bring them together to define what's important to bring their assets together. So right now I'm working with some other folks who are, also weavers to think about what does it look like to network these networks that are really, taking off in this moment of time where more and more people are waking up to the need for system change. And it's not, it doesn't exist. Like that connective tissue doesn't quite yet exist. So, how do we use technology? How do we use changing our way of thinking to do that effectively? And yeah, I'll just end with I think the other dimension of this work is that we don't talk about enough is that internal dimension, whether you want to think of it as like spiritual or, the work of kind of the therapy work, right? But internally, how do we also heal and shift the systems that we've been carrying within us? So I know there's a lot of work that's coming out of activist spaces to address this and, recognize that if we don't unlearn these systems, we're actually just going to replicate them, even as we say we're going about trying to do something different. So I would argue, to always try to include space for that in the work that we're doing, space for, maybe some kind of secular prayer or interfaith prayer, space for people to have conflict resolution, right? Or examine how is the way that I'm living and relating to others, perpetuating what I'm trying to move out of and what we're trying to move out of collectively. And it also helps us give each other grace. So I will conclude with that.
That is a wonderful conclusion. Oh, I'm getting the feedback. Actually, April, do you mind?
That was awesome, April. Thank you.
Thank
Hope it
you.
was without reverberation, but um, uh, I'm sure we have lots of questions. I know I've got questions, but I'll let others go first. Let's
Can you
see.
agree?
Yeah, you're getting lots of applause. Eleanor, are you able to speak without the echo?
How about now? Is that better?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, wonderful. I was just speaking a moment ago. Thank you, everyone, for your patience with the technical side of things. Like we were saying earlier, we're in a brand new building and so we're still sort of learning the ropes. Yeah, this was such a wonderful presentation, April. Thank you. Um, earlier I should have mentioned about the Next System Speaker series. Really we're hearing from leaders in social change work who are really bridging these questions about, okay, what is the system that we're critiquing and wanting to move beyond? And then really, what are the solutions? So thank you just again for sharing your wisdom with us. Our fellows here today have been reading about municipalism and different sort of ways of conceiving of community, right? It's not always a self-evident term. So I kind of want to start us off there by asking about, or just maybe sort of remarking on just what a well-developed sense of community this is. And I would maybe like to open up our questions to our fellows first, and then we'll get to folks who are online. And everyone online, again, thank you for joining us. And we'll get to you in just a moment. But I'd like to give our fellows a chance to share your thoughts or questions.
Well, if I can just say something really quickly about April, your work that you're doing and also the case studies that you did and explained were really beautiful. I mean, it's very hopeful to see that. I'm interning with DeNova and specifically working with childcare cooperatives. And as of right now, we do see that there are certain instances where there can be it can be helpful to communities like in Arlington, but then we have working class parents that unfortunately can't come in to help as much as they want to. So I think again, those case studies kind of bring a different like a different perspective of what could be, like yeah, the aspects that were put into, I think Indianapolis, you said Indianapolis, can be put into Arlington. I think I had a question in class, but it was about that pretty much, and how does stressing these networks and having like these communal closeness genuinely helping people, or is it leading to more vulnerable groups and more and equal access? I'm sorry, that was like worded weirdly. I was trying to think out loud and also look at my notes, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, do you mind? Okay, I'm trying to
Yeah.
make sure I
So,
understand your
yeah,
question. Yeah.
so the question was, does stressing local networks and closeness genuinely lead to more inclusive politics, or does Or might it accidentally exclude vulnerable groups that do not have equal access to those spaces?
That's such a good point. I do want to note that we've talked about in the field for quite a while, right? Like just connectivity and like power building for its own sake is not enough. It needs to be very conscious about that question of access. And I would also argue, the clear look at our, economic system and the many other parallel systems of oppression that have shaped our communities and people's lives need to be taken into account when we're doing this work. So we can be incredibly thoughtful about, who's in the room, who should be in the room. What do we need to do to make sure that everyone who's in the room who has historically been excluded feels comfortable, feels valued? And that also involves a lot of work before any kind of meeting or gathering happens, right? It involves relationship building. It can involve taking extra time to understand, and work through those layers of like internalized exclusion, right? And disempowerment to figure out like, okay, let's help this person see themselves as a valued member of this community that has something to offer. So that's why, things like learning conversations as a practice, those one-on-one or maybe two-on-one learning conversations are so important. And it's a classic organizing approach, right? But this, from an ABCD perspective, is not just, okay, how do we get this person to be a part of this campaign or this movement, but how do we really understand what does this person have to offer? What do they care about deeply that they would like to join in with others to do? I think to speak to the geographical point, I mean, communities, as we know, can take many different shapes and many different geographies, right? There's folks who find meaningful community with others who have a similar lived experience or a similar passion outside of their neighborhood. It can be transnationally, it could be, in all kinds of different networks, and technology helps us to do that. Um, but I do believe that there is something about the neighborhood, right? It's a space where people can wrap their minds around, I can make a difference here, right? And you can often have people included that otherwise wouldn't have accessibility to try to get all the way across the city, whether it's because of financial resources, they're too young to drive, they're too old to drive, right? Or they don't have a car. And also, that there's an identity in neighborhood. Sometimes it needs to be revived, right? If people have been very disconnected. But I am very passionate about neighborhoods, and also as we move into further economic and climate collapse, and a lot of the things, the repercussions of that. I'm hearing this in a lot of activist spaces as well. Like, we need to know our neighbors. We need to know our neighbors because we're going to need each other more and more. We need each other now, right? But as we probably won't be able to rely on the economic system as we know it, and also probably be facing more and more ecological disasters and changes, that's where we need to look, right? And then also the idea of, eventually, right? Like how could we federate these neighborhoods, right? And how can we be using neighborhoods as a space to grow our capacity for shared governance? Again, and always, right, as you pointed out, with the ethic of including everyone and taking the extra steps that are needed to make sure everyone has a chance to have a voice, especially those that have been excluded. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I just want to say, April, you are making some of the things we've talked about in class a little while ago so much more concrete and so just thank you so much. Yeah, we have another comment from Ifran.
Just like a small question just for the clarification. So when we are talking about like neighborhood as part of the governance, are we referring to the reconciliation of culture across boundaries and like a sense of altruism here?
Could you say that again a little bit slower and louder?
So like when we are focusing on neighborhood as part of the collective governance, are we also referring to the process of cultural reconciliation across the differences? And different culture coexist without sacrificing their core spirits and reconciling the common grounds and as part of altruistic what I should say, altruistic purposes. Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's, one of the things that I found really becomes possible with these asset-based processes, right? That are focused on relationship building, that are focused on discovering, what different cultures and gifts people bring, what passions they share, right? One of the things that I found is, you find if you're focusing on that, you can make visible and uncover that, these people who seemingly have such different backgrounds maybe all have a shared interest in basketball, right? Or in a
Mhm.
very particular form of history, right? And they actually really want to go geek out together. So finding those commonalities and having processes and, just that having it in your mind as someone who's facilitating or trying to build community, it really does foster like this greater connectivity across cultures, across ages. And also, the process of having people step into agency together around addressing an issue or a problem that they want to solve. I found those to be super effective. And of course, there's issues. It's not all like happy roses and it's not easy. It's not easy work.
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, if you're centering relationship and agency and assets, I find it's a lot easier than just getting people in a room together and telling them to like see above their differences.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. So a theme that really sticks out to me is discovery. And something really that I think that ABCD really excels at is putting that at the center of what we're doing instead of saying, okay, we have all the answers and we're going to go into a place and we're going to apply that. And because our rules and analysis are accurate, it's going to play out the way we imagine. This is kind of flipping this on its head and saying that actually the process of discovery of how people can work together, what already exists, what are people's talents. Um, you suddenly come to a much more um, abundant place, and we make the journey by walking it.
Mhm. Yep, that's one of our core
Yeah.
principles. I think that, yeah.
A quick time check. It's 2:26 right now. If there aren't any other questions from the fellows, um, now might be a nice time to open things to the folks who participated via Zoom. I'm not sure how many folks we still have, I think, 11 participants, and maybe 10 folks sort of kicking around. If someone from the Zoom would like to chime in with a question, please go ahead. Ah, there's Ben. Hello, Ben. Welcome.
I apologize. I was just saying that I could hear. I was answering the question in the chat. I didn't have a question,
Ah,
but
yes.
it's good. It's great talk. Great talk. Yeah,
I think
and
Yeah.
great.
John also has his hand up.
Yeah, I have a question, I guess. If I'll go after anyone else, but I just didn't see any other hands raised. So, um,
Take it away.
okay. So I was just thinking about, I love this talk, April, and I agree with Eleanor. I love how you flip this on its head, looking at community assets versus community needs, and the way you tell this story is very effective. I'm imagining my own neighborhood the whole time you're talking about this, and I think that is a lot of how we operate. One challenge we're finding, and it's not just my neighborhood, it's across Virginia right now and many other states, is this emphasis on gerrymandering, and so
Mm.
this is going to cut across neighborhoods in very interesting ways and by design, right? And it's meant to um, polarize us and amplify our differences. I think some of the strategies you're talking about are ways that we might be able to work in the opposite direction, trying to hold ourselves together. But I'm wondering if you've been dealing with this issue or heard about cases where these really do come together and seen some effective strategies for uh, building community amidst attacks from the federal government politics, especially
yeah,
around gerrymandering, which attacks our ability to govern ourselves.
right. No, that's a great question. I actually haven't come across anyone working or speaking about working with this specific issue. I do, my mind goes to the kinds of governance structures that we're able to build, right, when we start to develop that neighborhood cohesion. And recognizing, of course, that the gerrymandering is going to have severe impacts, right? And there is some division that's created politically. But at the same time, if we are able to focus some energies on, creating those structures of shared governance around, things we do have control over, and then can also build power to exert more political power, right, through connection to political organizing, right, and helping inform people and spread awareness. Like I do see that as ultimately really you know, I believe, right, if you're coming from like a municipalist viewpoint, we need to build our own structures of governance, right? And probably more and more the ones that are rooted in and controlled by corporate and capital interests are going to increasingly not represent us, right? And not serve us and certainly not serve our communities or our collective power. So in a way, maybe this is an early practice round at doing that and experimenting, right? I mean, I'd be really curious to hear if anyone else has
I mean, I think
specific.
it's splitting neighborhoods down the middle,
Yeah,
even
yeah,
not just parts of states, into different neighborhoods. This is like cutting right across neighborhoods,
yeah.
and their
Mhm,
municipal boards and everything else. So
mhm.
it's in those cases where I think you have interesting community studies to see what
Yeah,
happens to the ABCD principles.
yeah, that's a great question.
But I like the emphasis on place-based, and I was hoping you might have more time to elaborate. But let's hear from Robert first. Sorry, Robert. I think you're on.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, trying to get that unmuted. Thanks for your talk. This is really excellent. And I had a question earlier about getting people to work together to find the right communication, but you already kind of addressed that in your follow-up talk. So my question was just, what do you find is helpful when people want to work at different parts of the problem? Maybe they want to work more institutional problems. Other people want to work on, cultural behavior change efforts. Is there a way
Mhm.
that they kind of reconcile that when you're doing some of this diagramming and that people break into different groups? Or do they, try to find where the common ground is and work on one thing specifically?
Right. I mean, it's such a kind of case by case, because if we like to say, like, if you've seen one community, you've seen one community, Um, I do think there can be a lot of value in working with a group to answer that question themselves. I'm promise I'm not trying to punt the question just to the actual scenario. But I think that people find a lot of creative methods, right, for splitting into smaller focus groups, but staying connected around a larger issue. I know, sociocracy is a helpful tool that a lot of communities have used or kind of invented their own method for. Right. But I think oftentimes using models like, you have one larger overarching committee that's working on some, you know, uh, broad issue, but then allowing people to focus in on one smaller segment of that, but keeping some kind of rhythm of communication and coming back together. And also celebration is super, super important, right? With food, with something cultural. That's something that really healthy and strong communities integrate into their work. So it's not just like hard work all the time, right? Which can be really draining. So, probably building in some sort of celebratory aspect to the flow of how people are working on an issue, that maybe it's once a quarter, you get together. Also, I think having a shared asset map can be really useful because then you can help people see beyond like, oh, like I'm working on the right part of this issue versus, okay, like there's these different assets that are available. And if you have kind of a shared asset map, you can also be flowing resources and relationships back and forth between these sort of subgroups and sub teams. Yeah, and I think also letting things emerge and sunset as they might naturally do, right? And not getting too attached to like, our way of thinking that something needs to be addressed in an issue. Where there's energy for something that might be where people need to act right now, and could lead to them branching out to other things. So, yeah, those are my thoughts on that right now.
Wonderful.
Good question.
Yeah, yeah, we do have a little bit of time. Maybe we'll make this our last question if that's okay with folks. Um,
Which one?
I-
Who would I speak to?
yeah, I'm not sure where the speaker is in this.
I'll speak out.
Yeah.
Okay, in the case study you provided, somebody came from the outside into a community and acted as a catalyst for change. Are there cases, and can it be done from within the community, where they stop themselves as opposed to having something from the outside?
Yes. So, I mean, really, that initial study that was published by John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann, like all of those stories were stories of inside out change, because they spent the time and sat at the feet of neighbors and said, "Can you tell me a story of someone who's made something better here?" Those were all of the stories they've got, and so that was what then informed, the methodology and the framework. Um, I know there are a number of stories. There's a wonderful. Oh, it's escaping me right now. There's so many great great stories. But I can follow up with Eleanor. It was around folks who it's called Beyond Welfare. So it was actually started by a group of women who were on welfare and had the goal to, become independent of it. And they started an initiative with themselves and other people who were both experiencing that and also weren't, and created kind of a circles of care, process, to build like supportive relationships and help people kind of move in the direction that they wanted to go in their lives with support of community, drawing on assets. So that's like one story that comes to mind, but there are many, 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 many. There's also a really great article called The Role of the Outside Catalyst, by my colleague Terry Bergdahl. So I will follow up and share that as well, which kind of examines that tension of being, sometimes there is value in the catalytic role of an outsider. But we also need there's dimensions to it, right? It's not always bad. But ideally our role is to inspire and support and invest in and flow investment into those who can then lead from within.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Towards the end of your talk, April, do I have a second, Eleanor? Do we still have
Yeah, go for it.
1 minute?
Mhm.
It seemed that you were moving away from Jody and John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann's theory, I guess I would say, what they're learning from their book on change, which seems like it could apply to any community regardless of their political aspirations and values to some extent. To your own theories of change, to kind of build on that at higher levels, bringing in certain values. I think you were talking about changing our capitalist system. For starters, I don't know that John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann necessarily get at that, right? So I'm wondering, at what point did the light go off for you where you started to think, it's not just we don't just stop with this book.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think it had honestly been nagging at me for a while. Like I read Marx in college, right?
Mhm.
So I had come across this analysis of our economic system and how just, it really doesn't work. And understanding them like almost on a mechanical level why. Um, and it took me some years. I think what started to happen was honestly seeing, the Trump administration, right, and seeing things start to really go in an even more troubling direction, and trying to look, feeling like, there's an urgency here to figuring this out, and so then I started to really put it together, like, this work is great, but it's not enough. And also being curious as I thought about that, about, what other approaches are out there. Many I had seen kind of using ABCD language, but didn't even seem to be aware of that movement, or that methodology. And so kind of like poking my head out and finding other spaces, I came across one of Emily Kawano's talks on solidarity economy, and then reached out to her. And so then I discovered this whole solidarity economy world and, an updated analysis of not only the economic system, but, what we can do about it, right? And build ourselves out of it. So yeah, it was kind of a sense of increased danger and urgency that caused me to really, and also Neil McEnroy from the Democracy Collaborative. We had a really great intense conversation at one of the Resist and Build gatherings in Virginia that he's just like, yeah, I know ABCD, but that's not enough. He was just like really lining out for me. This looks at a horizontal power analysis, but not at the vertical one. So that was also when a light bulb went off. I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. Like we need to do more.
Great. Thank you.
That's great. All right. Well, in the interest of letting our fellows have a break, who've been with us thinking through really
Wow.
intense ideas since the morning, I think we'll adjourn here. Thank you again to everyone for participating, and just truly a wonderful thank you to April. And we look forward to all of your contributions at the Center for Next System Studies. April, if you could, if you don't mind writing down a couple of these recommendations, like I just wrote down the catalytic role of an outsider. But if you could shoot me an email with your slides, if you don't mind sharing them, and a couple of these recommendations that you've mentioned, I'll share them with the fellows. And yeah, just thank you so much.
Thank you. And just huge praise to each of the fellows and to everyone here. Please feel free to be in touch with me too if you have other questions or would like any other resources.
Thank you.
Always
And
happy to
I guess a reminder too, Eleanor, will you be sending around a recording?
Yes, I will be sending around a recording.
Sure, April would like one too for
Yeah.
people who couldn't make it. Okay, great.
And for folks who are still here, we actually have our next system speaker is, I believe, next week. We'll be hearing from Matt Burke and Hannah Gokaslan, who's a PhD student. Is sort of the way our scheduling worked out. We're back to back, at least these 2 weeks, and they'll be talking about degrowth as an approach for next system work. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, April.
Yeah.
Take
Yeah.
care.
Take care. Bye.